This is not fiction. It happened. And it keeps happening. People enter into love and they are either abused, treated as slaves, or killed. In this instance, Pearl Bryan was killed. She was super attractive, extremely beautiful, and her face resonated with her name. Her face looked like Pearl. This is not fiction. It happened, and it keeps happening. In February 1896, the decapitated body of Pearl Bryan, a young woman from Greencastle, Indiana, USA, was found in a Kentucky orchard. Her head was gone, taken by the man she loved. This is not just a story of one murder. It is the anatomy of how love, deceit, and domination intertwine, how the language of affection becomes the weapon of control, and how men across centuries have turned intimacy into execution. From the bloody orchard of 1896 to the digital crimes of today, the murder of Pearl Bryan repeats itself in new disguises. In every femicide, every betrayal, every woman silenced by the man who once said he loved her. Love has always worn two faces. One tender, one terrible. One whispers devotion, the other sharpens the knife. Let me give you the full details. On a cold morning in February 1896, a farmhand near Fort Thomas, Kentucky, stumbled upon the headless body of a young woman in an orchard. Her dress was torn open, her neck sheared cleanly from the body, her blood pooled thick in the grass. The snow around her was speckled with crimson, as though winter itself had been wounded. Her name was Pearl Bryan, a 22-year-old music student from Greencastle, Indiana. She had left home quietly, following a man she loved, a man who promised her a future. His name was Scott Jackson, a dental student, intelligent, ambitious, and utterly cold inside. He told her she was beautiful, told her he would fix everything, told her he loved her. By the time she realized she was pregnant, he had already begun planning her disappearance. Jackson and his friend Alonzo Jack Walling lured her to Cincinnati. There, in a small rented room, they prepared what they called a medical procedure. But what took place was not medicine, it was mutilation. When their crude attempt to abort the child failed, Jackson turned to what he considered the only solution. He mixed cocaine and water, forcing her to swallow it to silence her voice. When her throat could no longer cry out, he cut it open. Then methodically, he severed her head and walked away with it, hiding both her identity and his shame. The newspapers called it the crime of the century. But the century ended, and the crime did not. Today, the orchard is gone, paved over by time. Yet the story still happens, different names, same pattern. The method changes. Sometimes poison, sometimes bullets, sometimes words that bleed without leaving marks. The headlines blur together. Man kills girlfriend, woman found in river, lover charged with murder. We live among the ghosts of Pearl Bryan, multiplied and modernized, their stories trending briefly before being replaced by others just like them. This book is not merely about a murder in 1896. It is about the anatomy of romantic violence, how affection becomes possession, how tenderness mutates into control, how men who cannot own a woman's will attempt to own her body. It is about the way society excuses such evil when wrapped in the language of love, calling it tragedy instead of terrorism. Pearl Bryan's case is a dissection, not of her body, but of the eternal autopsy of desire itself. Through her story, we confront the same recurring pathology. A man who feels entitled to a woman's life. A woman taught to confuse charm with safety. A culture that reads violence as passion. When Jackson's noose tightened around his neck in 1897, he offered no apology. He died as he lived, calculating, cold, unrepentant. But the rope did not strangle the disease that produced him. The same arrogance, the same twisted logic, that if he cannot have her, no one can, still breathes in our world today. We have given it new names: domestic dispute, crime of passion, gender-based violence, intimate partner homicide. Each term tries to clean the blood, but the meaning remains unchanged. Love, when poisoned by ownership, becomes execution. This work revisits Pearl Bryan's murder not as a relic of history, but as a mirror of our present. It traces the facts of her killing, the frenzy of her trial, the spectacle of her execution, and the myth that followed. Yet beneath the sensationalism lies something older and darker, the universal story of men who mistake domination for affection, and of women who trust where the world has taught them to hope. In the end, Pearl's tragedy is not about one woman who lost her head in an orchard. It is about a world that keeps losing its conscience, a world still capable of turning love into the sharpest weapon of all. Told in haunting, unflinching detail, this narrative fuses forensic record, historical reporting, and psychological reflection. It is a mirror held up to an enduring truth. Romantic violence is not born of passion. It is born of ownership. The orchard. The sun had not yet burned the frost from the Kentucky grass when farmhand John Locke climbed the hill behind his orchard. It was Saturday, February 1st, 1896, the kind of morning when the world seems too still for cruelty. He walked with his collar up, breath rising in pale ribbons. Between the bare apple trees he noticed a dark shape lying oddly near the fence line, something that did not belong among roots and winter leaves. At first he thought it was a discarded sack. Then the wind shifted and the shape took on the pale color of human skin. He froze. A woman lay on her back, her arms bent stiffly, her hair matted with frozen blood. Her head was gone. The neck ended in a raw stump, black-red and glistening where it had bled out into the soil. Her dress was torn, the bodice open to the cold air, the skirt twisted around her waist as though she had been dragged. A pool of congealed blood circled her like a halo drawn in death. Locke staggered backward and ran for help. Within an hour, the orchard was crowded. Neighbors, constables, men from nearby farms, each drawn by the terrible rumor, a headless woman found by the creek. Horses snorted against their reins. Someone crossed himself. Another muttered that the devil had walked in Boone County during the night. The constable covered the body with a horse blanket, though it did little to hide what could not be unseen. By mid-morning, the coroner arrived. They lifted the body onto a wagon and drove it to Newport, the nearest town with a morgue. No one knew who she was. No jewelry, no papers, nothing except a pair of shoes stamped Greencastle Shoe Co. A single thread of identity in a puzzle soaked with blood. In the days that followed, the orchard became a spectacle. Reporters came from Cincinnati and Louisville, sketching the site, collecting gossip, describing the color of her hair and the pattern of her torn dress. Crowds trampled the ground where she had died, stealing bits of bark or pebbles as grim souvenirs. Farmers said the grass would never grow there again. When the post-mortem was conducted 2 days later, the truth grew darker. The young woman, no more than 20, was carrying a child nearly 5 months along. The doctor's report was clinical, almost gentle in its precision. But what it revealed was monstrous. The violence had been deliberate, not random. Someone had wanted her erased. The papers called her the mystery girl of Fort Thomas. Handbills offered rewards for the missing head. Meanwhile, in Cincinnati, 2 young men whispered in rented rooms, burning letters, washing blood from boots, pretending to sleep. One of them, Scott Jackson, still carried the calm of a man who believed himself smarter than justice. The other, Alonzo Walling, had already begun to tremble. The orchard kept its silence, but the earth had spoken. Every footstep, every drop of frozen blood, every torn thread pointed toward the same quiet, merciless truth. Pearl Bryan had come here in trust and left without a face. The investigation, the discovery of the body jolted 2 cities awake, Newport, Kentucky, where the corpse was found, and Cincinnati, Ohio, just across the river, where rumor said the story began. Before noon that Saturday, February 1st, the local constable had summoned the Campbell County coroner, and together they examined what the morning frost had concealed. Their first conclusion was plain. This was no robbery. Whoever had killed the woman had wanted her gone from the world, head, name, and all. By evening, the body lay in the morgue at White's undertaking establishment on York Street. Crowds gathered in the street outside, pressing against the doors, curious and horrified in equal measure. Inside, under the sharp smell of carbolic acid, the doctors worked. They noted the shoes, the dress, the traces of fine underclothing that spoke of a woman not poor. They wrote down the make of the shoes, Greencastle Shoe Company. It was the only thread in an otherwise headless mystery. Word traveled quickly across counties. Telegrams were sent to Greencastle, Indiana, asking if any young woman was missing. In a house on Bloomington Street, a music teacher named Pearl Bryan had not returned from a trip she said she was taking to visit friends in Indianapolis. Her family, uneasy but hopeful, sent descriptions to the Kentucky authorities. On Tuesday, a pair of shoe salesmen arrived in Newport to examine the shoes from the corpse. They knew the pair immediately. They had sold them to Pearl Bryan just weeks earlier. The identification was quiet but final. The mystery girl of Fort Thomas had a name. Now the police needed faces. Detectives Krim and McDermott from Cincinnati began tracing the trail backward. Letters, train tickets, and the whispers of hotel clerks. They learned that a man named Scott Jackson, a dental student at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery, had been courting Pearl Bryan for several months. He was charming, educated, and lived in a boarding house with another student named Alonzo M. Walling. Witnesses recalled seeing the two men in the company of a young woman late in January. Jackson had borrowed surgical instruments from the dental college. A night clerk remembered a valise, dark leather, heavy, with something dripping from the corner. When detectives reached Jackson's boarding house on Elm Street, he was seated at a table, reading a newspaper account of the murder. They arrested him without resistance. He denied knowing Pearl Bryan, then changed his story within the hour. His calm unnerved even the seasoned officers. Walling, arrested soon after, began to shake the moment he saw his friend led away in irons. Within a day, he began to talk. The two men were held at Cincinnati Police Headquarters, while reporters crowded the corridors. The story had leapt from column inches to front-page banners. It was no longer headless woman found, it was Indiana girl betrayed and murdered by her lover. Walling's statement came in fragments, half confession and half fear. He spoke of Jackson studying poisons, of reading medical texts, of mixing cocaine in water to silence Pearl before cutting her throat. He described the night drive across the bridge to Kentucky and the dark field where they left her body. Each word drove the nails deeper. The next morning, the police returned to the orchard with a search party. They sifted the frozen earth, turned the soil, scoured the riverbanks, even opened drainage sewers. They found nothing of the head. It was as though Jackson had carried it into another world. Meanwhile, in Greencastle, church bells tolled. The Bryans received the telegram confirming what they already feared. Her father, a respected farmer, collapsed upon reading it. Her mother refused to believe it until she saw the shoes herself. Back in Newport, the coroner's jury convened. Their verdict was brief and brutal. We find that the decapitation took place while Pearl Bryan was still alive. The investigation had done its work. What remained was judgment. In the crowded jail cells across the river, two men waited, one silent and smiling, the other whispering prayers through his trembling hands. The arrest in the press, the arrest of Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling, spread through Cincinnati and Newport like fire through dry timber. By Sunday morning, the murder of Pearl Bryan had become not just a local crime, but a national sensation. The telegraph wires carried her name into every newsroom east of the Mississippi. "Girl decapitated by her lover," screamed the headlines. "Headless tragedy in Kentucky orchard." At police headquarters, the corridors were jammed with reporters, constables, and citizens desperate for a glimpse of the accused. It was as if the city had turned into a theater and murder was the play. The air reeked of cigar smoke, ink, and sweat. Typewriters rattled in the next room while photographers begged for permission to take the men's portraits before they were moved to the jail. Scott Jackson sat calmly in his cell, his legs crossed, eyes half closed. When asked whether he had known Pearl Bryan, he replied, "I may have met the lady, yes." His voice was even, polite, rehearsed. To the detectives who had seen every manner of killer, his composure felt unnatural. Not the calm of innocence, but the coolness of calculation. Alonzo Walling, by contrast, was falling apart. The moment the door clanged behind him, he began to tremble. He asked for a Bible, then threw it aside. He called out for Jackson and was told his friend was in another cell. "He knows what happened," Walling cried. "He knows everything." It was not yet a confession, but it was enough to convince the officers they had the right men. Outside, the press turned Pearl's death into a morality tale. Editors wrote of fallen women and reckless passion, while others warned of the dangers of modern love, educated men without morals, women who trusted too easily. Churches held sermons on sin and seduction. Some papers painted Pearl as naive, others as willful. None seemed interested in her humanity. Her tragedy had become everyone's story but her own. At the same time, Jackson's photograph appeared in newspapers across the country, a handsome face, neatly groomed, with a faint trace of a smile. Underneath ran captions like "The Modern Bluebeard" and "The Fiend Who Loved Too Well." The public wanted an image to hate, and Jackson provided it. In Cincinnati, crowds gathered nightly outside the jail. Vendors sold refreshments. Street preachers shouted of damnation. Some people carried torches. The police doubled the guard. When Jackson and Walling were transported to Kentucky custody, a mob tried to overturn the wagon. The two prisoners stared straight ahead as fists struck the wooden panels. Jackson smirked once faintly when someone shouted, "Show us the head, doctor." By the time they reached the Campbell County Jail, they were notorious. Ministers visited them. Lawyers hovered for the prestige of the case. Letters arrived daily from women who claimed to pity or love Jackson, convinced of his innocence because of his looks and education. Human fascination had done what justice could not, turned a pair of murderers into celebrities. Detectives continued to interrogate them. Walling talked in circles, then silence, then fragments. Jackson denied everything. He claimed Pearl had left him alive and well. When asked where her head was, he said softly, "If I told you, you wouldn't believe me." Days later, new evidence emerged. Blood-stained clothing found in a trunk, a missing dissecting knife from the dental college, and traces of blood in the boarding house sink. The circle was closing, but the newspapers would not wait for trial. They had already written their verdict. In their columns, Jackson was the devil of modern science, Walling his trembling disciple, and Pearl Bryan the innocent Eve who paid the price for trusting intellect over innocence. The city fed on every word. Reporters followed the coroner, the sheriff, even the undertaker, each trying to extract one more gruesome detail. By March, the case had become a spectacle of moral theater. Jackson's face appeared on pamphlets and postcards. Songs were written about Pearl's death. The line between news and entertainment vanished. In a way, it was the first great media murder, a tragedy enlarged by the machinery of curiosity. Behind the headlines, in the dim cell of the Campbell County Jail, two men waited, one serene, one shaking, as the world outside turned their crime into story and their names into legend. The trial of Scott Jackson, opened on April 21st, 1897, in the packed courtroom of the Campbell County Courthouse in Newport, Kentucky. From the moment the doors opened, the crowd surged forward like water breaking a dam. People had camped overnight in the streets, clutching newspapers and handbills, desperate to see the men whose names had filled headlines for months. The courtroom smelled of varnish, ink, and sweat. The ceiling fan spun lazily in the spring heat. Women fainted. Men argued for standing space. Reporters filled the benches along the walls, telegraph operators waiting outside to rush every word to distant cities. What should have been a legal proceeding had become a national theater of morality and vengeance. Scott Jackson entered in a dark suit, his tie immaculate. He nodded politely to the jury and took his seat. His composure unsettled everyone who saw him. When the clerk read the charge, murder in the first degree of Pearl Bryan by decapitation, he did not flinch. Walling, seated beside him, looked pale and hollow-eyed, like a man already half buried. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney Samuel Pickett, built its case methodically. Witnesses came one by one, the cabmen who drove them across the bridge, the boarding house keeper who smelled blood, the shoe dealers who recognized the pair sold to Pearl Bryan. Each piece of evidence fit neatly into the outline of cruelty. Then came the doctors, their testimony cold and surgical. They described the cut at the neck, clean, precise, and done while the heart still beat. The courtroom gasped. The defense, desperate, claimed that Pearl had died from a failed abortion and that Jackson, panicked, had decapitated her to hide the evidence. It was a plea not for innocence but for mercy. Yet even this argument crumbled under the weight of detail. The cocaine solution, the dissecting knife, the missing head. The jury could see it. The deliberation, the planning, the method. Each day the press exaggerated further. One paper called Jackson the modern Cain with surgical hands. Another dubbed Walling the Judas of the operating room. Outside, vendors sold photographs of Pearl Bryan, her face framed in mourning borders. Sermons thundered across Kentucky and Indiana. A minister proclaimed, "This trial is not about one woman's death. It is about sin itself walking in daylight." When Scott Jackson took the stand, his voice was smooth, his gaze unwavering. He denied the killing, denied the love affair, denied even knowing that Pearl Bryan was pregnant. "Gentlemen," he said to the jury, "you asked me to speak against lies built on hysteria." His calmness, intended as control, read as arrogance. The jurors shifted uneasily. One later said, "He looked at us as if we were anatomy specimens." Walling did not testify. His lawyer feared his nerves would betray him. Instead, his earlier contradictions hung in the air like ghosts. When the judge adjourned that final day, silence filled the room. A silence so heavy it seemed to muffle the city outside. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman rose. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Scott Jackson, guilty of murder in the first degree and fix his punishment at death by hanging." The room erupted. Women screamed, men cheered. Reporters dashed for the telegraph lines. Jackson stood motionless, his hands folded. When asked if he had anything to say, he replied, "I am innocent, and God knows it." Walling's trial followed soon after, and the verdict was the same. 2 ropes, 2 gallows, 2 dates fixed on the calendar. The governor received petitions for clemency, thousands of signatures from citizens who opposed capital punishment. None of them moved the state. Pearl Bryan's parents remained silent, their grief beyond public comment. The mother who had once sewn her daughter's dresses now refused to speak her name aloud. The press feasted on the ending as it had on the beginning. They published every detail of the gallows construction, every word of the condemned men's final meals. The same public that had wept for Pearl now waited for blood with morbid patience. On the eve of execution, a journalist asked Jackson if he wished to make a confession. He smiled faintly. "You'll find the head when the world ends," he said. When dawn came, both men were led to the scaffold behind the Newport jail. The crowd outside sang hymns that dissolved into shouts. The prisoners mounted the steps together. The nooses were placed. The preacher prayed. And when the trapdoors fell, justice, or what passed for it, had done its work. The hanging. Dawn came cold on March 20th, 1897. A pale light crept through the iron bars of the Campbell County Jail, touching the faces of 2 men who had not slept. Outside, a low mist clung to the streets of Newport. By 6 o'clock, the city was awake. Black-coated men moving through the fog, wagons rumbling toward the courthouse square, women peering from windows. It was hanging day. The sheriff's men had prepared the gallows behind the jail. 2 ropes hung from the crossbeam, coiled neatly, their hemp fibers rough and yellow. Carpenters had tested the trapdoors twice. Everything was measured and precise, as though justice itself required geometry. Inside, Scott Jackson dressed carefully. He shaved, combed his hair, and asked for a clean collar. When the chaplain entered, Jackson stood and greeted him as if for a business meeting. "I have no confession to make," he said. "I have nothing to take back." He accepted a small Bible, then placed it on the table untouched. Alonzo Walling knelt in the corner of his cell, muttering prayers that dissolved into sobs. He asked to see Jackson, but the guards refused. The 2 men would not meet again until the gallows. At 10 o'clock, the invited witnesses, lawmen, doctors, and a handful of journalists, were admitted to the yard. Beyond the stone wall, thousands had gathered in the streets, pressing against the gates, climbing trees and rooftops to see over the high wall. Vendors sold hot coffee and hymn pamphlets. Children sat on shoulders. A preacher's voice rose from the crowd, shouting, "Let their death be a warning to the wicked." The noise was a tide, prayer and spectacle intertwined. At 11:30 a.m., the jail doors opened. Jackson emerged first, flanked by deputies. He walked upright, eyes forward, coat buttoned, every inch the calm student he had once been. Walling followed, pale as wax, lips trembling, supported by 2 guards. The chaplain climbed the steps ahead of them, reading from the Psalms. On the scaffold, the sheriff asked for last words. Jackson's voice was steady. "I am innocent of this crime. I have been wronged, but I forgive those who condemned me. That is all." Walling lifted his head briefly. "I only want to say that I die wrongfully. God knows I told the truth." The deputies adjusted the ropes. The hoods were pulled over their faces. For a moment, the yard fell silent, as if the whole crowd outside had stopped breathing. The trap was released. The beams cracked. The ropes snapped taut. Jackson's body dropped cleanly, the neck breaking instantly. Walling's death took longer. His legs twitched, then were still. The witnesses filed out in silence. Reporters wrote their dispatches on the spot. Within an hour, telegraph wires carried the news across the country. Jackson and Walling hanged at Newport, died without confession. By afternoon, printed extras hit the streets. Vendors shouted headlines. Crowds cheered. And by evening, the nation turned its attention to other things. The bodies were cut down and delivered to their families. No one ever found Pearl Bryan's head. Search parties scoured the Ohio River for months, dredging mud and pulling up only weeds and stones. Some said it had been thrown into a sewer, others that Jackson had buried it on the grounds of the dental college. In time, the truth was buried with him. Years later, the jail was rebuilt, the gallows torn down, the orchard where Pearl died swallowed by the growing town. But the story did not die. It lingered in whispers and old newspaper clippings, in the superstition that the site was cursed. People claimed to hear weeping in the night, to feel a presence where the gallows once stood. Bars were built over those stones, and patrons swore that glasses rattled by themselves when her name was spoken. But the real haunting lay elsewhere. Not in ghosts, but in the pattern. The same story, the same structure, trust given, love twisted, body broken. A century had passed, and yet the orchard had only changed its shape. It now lived in apartments, motels, and alleys. It lived in headlines and in silence. Pearl Bryan was not the first nor the last. Her murder marked an age that liked to believe itself civilized, yet carried barbarity in its heart. The rope that ended two lives could not strangle the idea that made them killers. The idea that love can excuse domination, that a woman's life can be owned, silenced, and disposed of. That idea has survived every century's progress. The heads may roll in different ways now, through bullets, poison, or silence, but the orchard remains, and so does the crime. The aftermath. The gallows at Newport stood empty by noon. The ropes had been cut down, the beams dismantled, the yard scrubbed with lime. What had taken months to build and hours to report was erased in a single afternoon. Yet outside the prison walls, the story of Pearl Bryan refused to fade. For weeks afterward, crowds gathered at the cemetery where she was buried. Strangers left flowers at her grave, some out of pity, others out of morbid fascination. People came from as far as Ohio and Tennessee to stare at the headstone that read simply, Pearl Bryan, 1874, 1896, murdered. The head itself was never found. It became a symbol of absence, of the part of the truth that no one could recover. Reporters returned to the orchard and wrote of ghostly cries in the night, of women's voices carried on the wind. The same newspapers that had feasted on her death now printed ghost stories to sell their next editions. In Greencastle, her family withdrew from public life. Her father aged quickly. Her mother stopped playing the piano and covered the mirrors in the house. The town avoided speaking her name. To them, Pearl was not legend but loss, an open wound that never closed. Every train whistle sounds like it's calling her home, one neighbor said. But the story had already grown beyond grief. Ministers turned it into sermon. Teachers turned it into warning. Journalists turned it into business. The murder of Pearl Bryan became one of America's first true crime sensations, a template for how private tragedy could be translated into public fascination. In Kentucky, moral reformers cited the case as evidence of modern degeneracy. They condemned urban freedoms, women traveling alone, and the new class of educated men who played God with science. Legislators debated new abortion laws. Preachers thundered about sin in the age of anatomy. The case had turned from horror into metaphor, used by everyone, understood by no one. For the police and courts, the Bryan murder became a turning point. The investigation had relied on forensic clues, shoe brands, telegrams, chemical traces, a new science for a new century. From it grew the recognition that crimes of passion could be studied with the same precision as any disease. Yet the science did little to treat the sickness itself. The killings continued, different names, same pattern. By the early 20th century, the legend had overtaken the facts. Locals spoke of a woman's ghost wandering near the old orchard, headless but humming a lullaby. Children dared one another to call her name at midnight. Ballads were written. Poor Pearl Bryan, she trusted her lover too well. Bars and inns near the site renamed themselves after her. The crime had become folklore, a warning wrapped in entertainment. Decades passed. The world changed its clothes, electric lights, automobiles, telephones, radios. But the story still fit. In every generation, some woman became Pearl Bryan again. In every city, some man thought love gave him the right to kill. Each new case was dressed in the modern language of the day. Domestic dispute, lover's quarrel, crime of passion. The words changed, but the act did not. The world likes to imagine that time erases barbarity, that progress and education cleanse the heart. But the Bryan case lingers precisely because it exposes the opposite, that intellect without conscience is only another weapon. The instruments of Scott Jackson's trade, his scalpels, his anatomical texts, his calculated precision, were not proof of modernity. They were proof of how civilization refines cruelty. Scott Jackson displayed the calm, detached composure, typical of what modern psychology would describe as psychopathic. He was charming, articulate, intelligent, and apparently devoid of guilt. Such people are skilled at mirroring affection. They study what others need emotionally and feed it back to them to gain trust. When that trust turns into dependence, they feel omnipotent, not connected. His background as a dental student exposed him to anatomical dissection and the cold logic of precision. When moral empathy is already thin, scientific detachment becomes a justification. Life turns into an object to be solved, not a relationship to be honored. His decision to decapitate her to prevent identification shows calculating cognition without effect. Classic instrumental psychopathy. Pearl's pregnancy threatened his social image, his career, his self-concept as the clever, controlled man. Psychologically, such individuals fear humiliation more than guilt. When shame looms, they react with annihilation, remove the source of shame. Killing her was, in his distorted reasoning, problem-solving. Alonzo Walling was younger and emotionally fragile. He exhibited anxiety, tremors, guilt, and contradictory statements. Psychologically, he was the follower type, the kind who seeks identity through attachment to a dominant friend. Under Jackson's charisma, he surrendered conscience for belonging. In modern terms, co-offending under coercive influence. His erratic confessions and prayers suggest dissociation, the mind breaking contact with unbearable reality. He could not integrate what he had done with who he believed he was. Pearl Bryan was not naive so much as culturally conditioned. Late Victorian women were taught that love meant faith and submission. Jackson's education, sophistication, and promises activated that ideal of rescue through romance. Psychologically, her trust was an act of hope within narrow social options, not foolishness. Once pregnant, she entered the psychological trap of dependent attachment, bound to the very person who endangered her, yet emotionally unable to flee because her identity and future were tied to him. Control, exposure, panic, erasure. Jackson's control over Pearl cracked when pregnancy made their secret visible. Exposure threatened status. Panic followed, but his version of panic was cold, logistical. Erasure became his solution. If the witness, Pearl, and the evidence, the head, vanish, so does shame. His medical training turned the body into an object. The act of decapitation is symbolically perfect for his psychology, the destruction of identity. He didn't just kill her. He removed her face, the human sign of recognition. Psychopaths split emotional reality. There is no continuity between affection and violence. To him, the woman he courted and the body he mutilated were not the same person. Once she threatened his control, she became a problem, not a partner. The social psychology of the aftermath, public catharsis. The crowd's frenzy was collective projection. Their horror and fascination allowed them to externalize their own repressed fears about sexuality, sin, and the new modern freedom between men and women. Watching Jackson die was society's way of cleansing itself. Gender panic. The 1890s were anxious about changing gender roles. Pearl's death confirmed the moral narrative that independent women meet ruin. In this sense, society unconsciously colluded with the murderer's logic by turning her into a cautionary symbol rather than a victim. The deeper psychological meaning. At its core, this crime was about power disguised as love. Jackson's need was not for intimacy, but for domination masked by romance. The murder's brutality, cutting away the head, expresses the final wish of such a personality. To silence, to erase, to own even the narrative of the other's existence. Psychologically, it reveals a timeless equation: possession plus fear of exposure, violence. This pattern repeats across eras, cultures, and technologies. The tools change: scalpels, guns, text messages, online humiliation, but the psychic structure remains identical. The Pearl Bryan case was an early mirror of what today we call intimate partner homicide, a lethal intersection of narcissism, control, and cultural permission. Now let's answer the big question. Why did Pearl give in sex instead of demanding marriage first? Because that is how things were in those days. You wait for marriage before sex. Sex before marriage was taboo. So why did Pearl give in sex instead of demanding marriage first? Pearl lived in the 1890s, when women's choices were tightly constrained by religion, social reputation, and economic dependence. Courtship often carried an implied promise of marriage. A man of education like Jackson could easily frame physical intimacy as proof of love, or as something that would lead to marriage soon. In that context, emotional dependence and idealization. She likely saw him as her future, educated, worldly, able to lift her out of small-town limits. Romantic attachment and hope can override caution, especially when trust feels like love's proof. Manipulation and power imbalance. Jackson was older, trained in persuasion, and had social and intellectual authority. He could have presented sexual intimacy as a natural step between people already engaged in spirit, promising secrecy or imminent marriage. Gender conditioning. Women were raised to preserve chastity yet also to please and not challenge male authority. Saying no too firmly risked losing the relationship. Saying yes could be seen as commitment. Within those mixed messages, consent was easily coerced through emotional pressure rather than force, isolation, and secrecy. Once she crossed the line socially, she was trapped. To confess the relationship would invite shame. To end it would mean abandonment. That psychological isolation is what predators exploit most effectively. So, it wasn't simply that she gave in, it was that the cultural script of her time and Jackson's manipulation collapsed. Her power to bargain for marriage first. She believed she was already loved and promised. He knew she was already vulnerable.
In the silence of the night, whispers of the past, echoes of the ancients, their wisdom holds fast. Through the sands of time where shadows dance and play, you wander through the stories that lead us on our way, linking the ancient past to a divine future bright. In every heartbeat we find our guiding light. With the stars above we trace our roots and wings. In this symphony of light, hear the song it sings. From the pyramids to the temples where history calls, footsteps of the ancients within these hallowed walls. Every stone a story, every turn a grace. In the fabric of our journey we find our rightful place, linking the ancient past to a divine future path. In every heartbeat we signed our guiding light. With the stars above we trace our roots and wings. In this symphony of life, hear the song it sings. Time is but a river flowing ever on, carrying our dreams and the lessons we've drawn. In a tapestry of ages, woven threads of gold, a promise of tomorrow in the stories we behold. So let us stand together, hand in hand, side by side, embracing the connection where our hearts abide. With each note that rises, we unlock the door to the sacred bond that ties us evermore, linking the ancient past to a divine future bright. In every heartbeat we find our guiding light. With the stars above we trace our roots and wings. In this symphony of life, hear the song it sings. final curtain falls and silence fills the air, we'll cherish all the moments, the love, the hope we share. From the ancient to the future, together we will thrive. In the echoes of existence, we are truly alive.